Okay, hello and welcome everyone to this first installment in our Delta on the Move lecture series here at the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Hong Kong, the first installment for the semester, I should say. My name is Ghassan Moazin, and I'm an assistant professor here at the Institute, and I'm also joined by the principal investigator of the Delta on the Move project at the Institute, Dr. John Wong. And the Delta on the Move project is a relatively new project we have at the Institute that looks at the global historical development of the Greater Bay area. And the lecture series kind of tries to bring together different scholars that work, broadly speaking, whose work, broadly speaking, touches upon this topic. I should also say that this is, because this talk is so broad and wide-ranging, it is a This is co-organized with our Chinese Business History webinar, so I hope we are also seeing a few of you who are regulars for that webinar here in the audience. So today we're very honored and very pleased and very glad to welcome to the webinar Dr. Elizabeth Ingleson from the London School of Economics and Political Sciences, where she is an assistant professor in the International History Department. Professor Ingleson was educated at the University of Sydney and then held a postdoctoral fellowship at Yale University before starting her appointment at the LSE. She has published widely on US-China relations, US-China trade, and her new book is coming out next year with Harvard University Press called Made in China, When US-China Interests Converged to Transform Global Trade. So we're all looking forward to that as well, of course. The talk today that she has kindly agreed to give us is titled Dragon Lady Traders of the 1970s, How the US and China Rebuilt a Trade Relationship Through Textiles and Hong Kong. Before I hand things over, I should say that, say a few words about the format. So Professor Ingleson is going to talk for around 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. If you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A button in Zoom, and I will then read them out during the Q&A for Professor Ingleson to answer. But Elizabeth, if you are ready, then please feel free to get started.
Great, thank you so much. It's a real honor to be here and to share some of my work with you all. I'm going to share screen. Let's see if this can work okay. So good? Yep, fantastic. Have a look. There we go.
Yeah.
There we go. So I want to talk today about a story and a set of ideas that come from my forthcoming book, Made in China. And there are three key things I want to do in sort of outlining the book and the big key ideas. And the first is to sort of discuss the themes and questions that I address in the book before turning to the story of Veronica Yap and Dragon Lady Traders, a company that she established very early on in the 1970s. And I'll conclude today with a few sort of takeaway arguments of the book and of the stories that I will tell you today. So the key questions and themes of this book, which will be coming out in spring 2024, really joins a vibrant conversation amongst scholars who ask how and why China converged with the capitalist system, and additionally, when this convergence began. Now, an earlier debate amongst scholars, which many of you may be familiar with, sought to understand what Kenneth Pomeranz memorably described as the Great Divergence in industrialization between Northwest Europe and East Asia since the mid-18th century. By the mid-19th century, as Europe was transformed by the Industrial Revolution, China's economy was thrown into ruins by Japanese, European, and American imperial competition. In distinction to this great divergence, a group of economists have put forward the notion of convergence. as a means of understanding China's relationship to global capitalism in the latter part of the 20th century. And if scholars have turned their attention to what might be labelled the Great Convergence, Deng Xiaoping's reforms announced in December 1978 loom large in many accounts. But scholars disagree on the extent to which these reforms marked a new beginning in China's engagement with global capitalism. One group of scholars do see 1978 as a starting point, tracing the origins of China's extraordinary economic growth to Deng's reforms. It was in the 1980s that China escaped the debt trap that ensnared other developing nations and that ultimately led to the Soviet Union's collapse. In these scholars' telling, it was the reform era of the 1980s and 1990s that enabled China to develop its own unique form of political economy that converged with global capitalism and enabled China to lift so many of its people out of poverty. A second group of scholars emphasise continuity between the Mao and Deng eras. Experiments with marketization and trade, they argue, occurred from the very founding of the People's Republic. One scholar goes so far as to suggest an unending capitalism in China, even at the height of communist rule. In his telling, consumerism, which persisted in small pockets of the country, was a sign that Mao's economy was, in fact, a variety of capitalism. The PRC was therefore never the socialist economy Mao strove so hard to achieve. My book similarly seeks to blur the 1978 divide, but unlike scholars who emphasise continuity throughout the Maoist era, I see the major turning point in China's convergence with capitalism to lie in the late 1960s and early 1970s. I join a third group of scholars who locate the sources of China's 20th century convergence with capitalism in the latter years of the Cultural Revolution. Exploring Maoism at the grassroots as well as from above, these scholars situate the Cultural Revolution as a key moment in China's political economy. The paradox of the Cultural Revolution, this body of literature shows, is that it wrought such extreme social and political upheaval that it unintentionally opened the way for new institutions and reform policies to emerge. It was amidst the social and political chaos of the 1970s that China's leaders within and beyond the elite level of politics experimented with economic reorganization that sowed the seeds of the reforms that came afterwards. I add two overlooked dynamics to this convergence or to these conversations amongst scholars of China, both of which are crucial to understanding China's convergence with global capitalism. First, it explores the growth of trade in the late Mao era of the late 1960s and 1970s, of which there has been remarkably little attention until recently. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, China had maintained small levels of trade with foreign nations, especially the Soviet Union and the Third World. From the late 1950s, China also began to trade with some capitalist nations, such as Japan, Britain, and West Germany. But it was only during the 1970s that Mao began to increase China's overall levels of trade for the first time since the communist victory in 1949. And it was China's engagement with advanced capitalist democracies, not members of the socialist world, that drove this growing trade. Now, at first, these changes were only slowly perceptible. In 1969, China's total trade stood at 3.8 billion, about the same that China's foreign trade had been in the 1950s and 1960s. In 1971, this had risen to an all-time high of 4.8 billion. By 1974, the value of trade had skyrocketed to a further 14 billion. China's total trade remained around this level until 1978, when it jumped, as you can see in the image, to 21 billion. And from there, it continued to rise, persisting well into the 21st century. China's growing trade in the 1970s was central to its convergence with the capitalist world. It provided China with technology, it assisted China's economic development, it led China to expand its trade institutions, such as trade fairs and advertising outlets. And most importantly, it was entwined with the second dynamic that I focus on in the book that is often taken for granted by scholars whose primary focus is on China. And that is changes within US capitalism itself. Because in order for China to converge with global capitalism, the United States and its economy needed to accommodate China's needs too. For 20 years, the US economy had been underpinned by a Cold War division between capitalism and communism. In fact, US-China trade was the ultimate casualty of the economic Cold War, blocked by a strict embargo since the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950. The small amount of trade that did flow between the United States and other communist nations was understood in binary terms as East-West trade, not integrated ones. In the 1970s, this binary remained in place, but elements of it began to soften when it came to trade with China. In 1971, the United States finally lifted its 21-year trade embargo, and China began to be seen not through the Cold War lens of communist threat, but instead through the lens of capitalist profit. And this was often despite the fact that profit did not always or readily materialize for many business people in this decade. In most parts of the world, the Cold War ended in the late 1980s when the Soviet Union dissolved and the US-led vision of neoliberal capitalism became the key organizing principle for social development. But in the case of US-China relations, the Cold War ended without systemic collapse in either nation. Instead, Cold War divisions between these two nations fizzled out during the 1970s through a gradual convergence between the Chinese state and US capitalists. So in addition to asking why China converged with global capitalism then, I'm interested in the reverse too. Why did US capitalists start to incorporate China, the world's largest communist nation, into their visions of the future? And what did these visions look like? The answers to these questions require us to look at China's convergence with global capitalism as a multi-directional process that involved decisions both within and beyond China itself. Scholars are beginning to show the importance of neighboring countries such as Hong Kong and Singapore to this integration. Many emphasize the role of overseas Chinese people in bringing China into the capitalist system. But in order to understand these dynamics more fully, we need to look also at the largest and most powerful player in the capitalist economy at the time, the United States. The capitalist system with which China began to converge was not static, but instead a shifting, dynamic arrangement that itself underwent significant transformations in the 1970s. And the changes within the United States lay at the heart of many of these developments. The book focuses in particular on US business people and corporations such as Veronica Yap and her Dragon Lady traders, who you see in the bottom left-hand corner here and we'll come to in a minute. And it's in this period in the 1970s that for the first time since the Korean War, business people from across the United States began to jockey for visas and insights into a trade market that European and Japanese rivals had had access to for years. Large multinational corporations like Walmart and Apple would, by the end of the 20th century, come to be most associated with US-China trade. Yet it was the new generation of US business people in the 1970s, including Veronica Yap, Charles Abrams, and David Rockefeller, who paved their way. And maverick entrepreneurs and suited executives from huge US corporations are not the usual protagonists in the histories of 1970s US-China relations. Instead, President Nixon and Chairman Mao and the elite policymaking they represent have dominated the narratives of bilateral relations in this era, just as Nixon and Kissinger quickly turned their gaze back to geopolitics after adjusting trade rules. So too have historians devoted only passing interest to the trade relationship that unfolded. There's lack of attention to US business people who traded with China in the 1970s is partly because the value of trade was tiny, only around $2 billion by the end of the decade. When we look at trade in qualitative rather than quantitative terms, however, and when we focus on business people and corporations, we see this fundamental transformation in the bilateral relationship that ultimately had long-term repercussions for global capitalism and labor. By drawing together China's expansion of trade with the economic changes happening within the United States, I argue that China's convergence with global capitalism took shape in the 1970s because some US business people, with the encouragement of Chinese policymakers, began to see trade with China as a means of accessing cheap labor rather than a place to absorb US goods. In the process, they reconfigured what it meant to even speak of US-China trade. Over the course of the 1970s, business people from the United States and policymakers in China worked together to transform the very meaning of the China market from a place to sell US goods to a site instead of cheap labor. Now, this was a very significant reimagining of how trade should operate, and it lay at the heart of China's integration with the capitalist order. It was a transformation that was profoundly shaped by the wider economic and political changes occurring in both nations in the 1970s. As the patterns of global trade shifted and US corporations increasingly outsourced their manufacturing to cheaper overseas labor, some business leaders saw China as holding the potential to not only join, but also assist in this process. For their part, pragmatists within the Chinese Politburo experimented with ways of increasing their exports to fund their purchases of industrial goods. Both groups were met with considerable opposition from within their nations, but their efforts nonetheless prevailed. And for hundreds of years, however, US-China trade looked very different. Since first contacts in the 18th century, US merchants had understood trade with China to mean expanding their exports. Throughout the United States and Europe, the imagined possibility of a vast landmass teeming with potential customers compelled business people to trade with China. In the early 20th century, Missouri ad man Carl Crow encapsulated this idea with his 1937 best-selling book, based upon his 25 years living and working in China. Its evocative title quickly saw 400 million customers become a metonym for the potential profits to be made from trade with China. In the 1970s, some US business people and their Chinese counterparts began to see a new promise: 800 million workers as well. They not only imported items such as porcelain, robes, and tapestries, which had overt links to China, but they also began to purchase shirts, shoes, and gloves that did not have obvious connections to China itself. Encouraged by Chinese traders and pragmatists who were keen on increasing their exports, they together reconfigured the very meaning of the China market. Just 30-odd years after Crow published his best-selling book, US business people, alongside Chinese traders, began to transform the centuries-long vision of a China market filled with 400 million proverbial customers, into one of 800 million workers instead. And the transformation of the China market from 400 million customers to 800 million workers was enabled, I show, by three interconnected factors: a cultural change in which China was reconceived from Red China to an amicable trade partner to a made in China partner. It was propelled by different diplomatic approaches to how trade could be used to assist geopolitical negotiations. And it was underpinned by economic transformations in both nations. And all three of these factors I show intersected in ways that ultimately reconfigured the very meaning and practice of US-China trade. Now, in the book, I focus on all three of these dynamics and the ways that they played out amongst themselves and together in the 1970s. But I want to focus on the story of Veronica Yap and the ways that her actions and her decisions help us see the intersection of two of these factors, the cultural and economic factors occurring in this era. And I want to do so by taking us to New York City in spring 1971. The US ping pong team had just been invited to China on April 6, and a week later, on April 13, President Nixon had removed some restrictions on trade with China. From her Fifth Avenue apartment in Manhattan, Veronica Yap, an architect in her early 30s, had been following the nightly bulletins and newspapers as they filled with news of ping pong diplomacy and easing trade and travel restrictions with China. Born in Shanghai to a wealthy family, Yap and her parents fled to Hong Kong on the eve of the Chinese Communist Party's victory in 1949. After she finished school, she flew to the United States to study architecture at Mills College in Oakland, California, before moving again to New York City, where she completed graduate studies at Columbia University. She remained in New York, where she worked as an architect and met her husband, Ernesto Yap, an engineer at IBM. As Nixon lifted the barriers to trade with China, Veronica Yap imagined a role for herself in the newly opening trade relationship. She had a wardrobe filled with Chinese jackets and dresses that she had bought years ago when visiting family in Hong Kong. In recent months, she'd received several compliments when she wore them. And while some Americans remained wary of Red China, the high-end fashion world coveted Chinese clothing. The appeal was compounded by the fact that this latest trend came to Fifth Avenue via France. Grey and blue workers' uniforms were bestsellers at Paris's Galeries Lafayette, the New York Times reported in its fashion pages in August. Parisian crowds were particularly eager to buy workers' suits that had been made in China, which they felt, and I quote, had a special cachet of authenticity. So seeking to capitalize on the excitement for Chinese fashion, Yap spoke with executives at Bloomingdale's and Abraham & Straus to gauge their interest in stocking Chinese clothing in their department stores. She brought with her the clothes she had in her own wardrobe. Would they be interested, she inquired, in selling such goods in their stores? The executives jumped at the opportunity. Soon after, Yap telegrammed a friend in Hong Kong, Winnie Yung, whom she had met in California as a student at Mills College. The department stores were interested and they wanted samples as soon as Yung could send them from Hong Kong. Yap and Yung, along with two other friends, soon set up a company, Dragon Lady Traders. Yap had decided on the name in haste. Dragon Lady had been her nickname in college. It was a character, Dragon Lady, in a popular adventure comic of the late 1930s, Terry and the Pirates. Coming in the context of growing Japanese aggression, the Chinese heroine blended danger, strength, and erotic allure. She could be a damsel in distress while also bravely fighting Japanese fascism. And these contradictions work together to reinforce the trope of a tough yet delicate Asian woman in American popular culture. By the mid-1970s, a few years after establishing Dragon Lady Traders, Yap thought about changing its name to something she reflected a little more dignified. Yet her lawyers and business partners resisted, feeling that this would ultimately undermine the name recognition they had built. Yap had reworked the trope into a profitable brand. And one of the key benefits of this approach, Yap acknowledged, was that Dragon Lady Traders brought an additional significance. It's also meaning it's a company run by a woman, she added after some consideration. And we like that. The company offered American consumers a familiar and therefore unthreatening way of conceptualizing China, connecting goods from communist China to these larger associations of Asian femininity. Yap's Dragon Lady Traders helped instigate a cultural reconfiguration of China, from red threats to a source of familiar racialized gender norms. Yap was one of the first Americans to travel to China in late 1971, before Nixon. She, like all foreign business people, traveled to Guangzhou for the twice yearly Canton Trade Fair, where China conducted almost half its total trade in this era. When she returned to the United States, her goods sold out almost instantly. American consumers were so excited, she recounted, if we run out of large, they'll take medium, and if they run out of medium, they'll take small. It's incredible, she gasped. She brought back used mouse suits that retailed for $130, which she noted were, and I quote, popular in colleges. Advertising Chinese jackets and workers' uniforms as exotic Maoist commodities, Yap and other US importers helped reconfigure larger public ideas about China's communism. For university students, the appeal lay in purchasing signifiers of radical politics, the commodification of dissent, as historian Thomas Frank has put it. But the real impact of these items was not radical at all. On the contrary, the imported Maoist goods helped depoliticize how liberal Americans thought about China's communism. At a time when Andy Warhol began producing his iconic portraits of Mao Zedong, this was an era of the kitschification of China's revolution. No longer a threat, China's communism could be a mere fashion statement. US importers and the goods they sold were essential to the changing public perceptions of the United States' former Cold War foe. Yap and other US importers who traded with China in the 1970s helped transform the way American consumers thought about China's communism from a Cold War threat to a site of everyday consumer products. As trade began in the early 1970s, importers emphasized China's exotic past, echoing patterns of US trade with China of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Well, they transformed, as Yap did, China's communist presence into a desirable fashion item. And these cultural changes paved the way for increased consumer interest in and acceptance of Chinese imports of all kinds. By the middle of the decade, these two dynamics, the exotic China and quotidian goods, began to operate together within the same marketing campaigns. In other words, importers began to capitalize upon and draw upon the exotic of China in order to sell everyday items such as t-shirts or shoes or in fact, tapestry making kits, which I explore in the book. And by 1974, Yap too was using the brand of Dragon Lady Traders to diversify from Mao jackets to items such as men's shoes that were made in China according to her own specifications. You can see the extraordinary 1970s fashion here on display. So Veronica Yap would go on to pioneer arrangements whereby Chinese traders manufactured clothing according to her specifications. The cultural changes she was a part of in the early 1970s, celebrating China trade, helped importers sell Chinese goods of all kinds. By the middle of the decade, several companies, including Dragon Lady Traders, used this interest in an exotic China to advertise everyday imports, shirts, shoes, and gloves, whose only connections to China were labels declaring made in China. As US business and fashion elites exoticized their new trade partner, they helped promote a cultural acceptance of the word China appearing on the labels of everyday consumer goods. But this was not, of course, a linear change. There are plenty of examples of consumers boycotting Chinese goods and boycotting companies that stocked Chinese goods. In 1978, for example, the leading US business organization for China trade still had to remind its own members that the term Red China was, I quote, unacceptable to the Chinese. So the transition from Red China to Made in China was uneven. Yet throughout the 1970s, US capitalists and importers set in motion a remarkable evolution in how US consumers understood the erstwhile Cold War enemy. This shifting landscape of US-China trade, from Red China to Made in China, and from 400 million customers to 800 million workers, was highly contingent and uncertain, and very few predicted that the relationship would boom anytime soon. Throughout the decade, most Americans interested in trade focused their attention not on China, but on Japan and its impact on the United States. One economist, Branko Milanovic, reflecting in the early 21st century on the projections that his economist peers had made in the 1970s, has recently noted that, and I quote, China is remarkable by its absence in these books. No one took notice of China yet. But there was, in fact, one key group of Americans who loudly and consistently paid attention to China's economic potential well before economists and policymakers of the 21st century. From the very reopening of trade ties in the early 1970s, organized US labor representatives and workers, especially in the textile industry, warned of the impact that trade with China would have if greater industry safeguards were not implemented. Their concerns came in a volatile context when US imports of manufactured goods were rising, manufacturing employment was decreasing, and the combined effects of skyrocketing inflation and unemployment spurred a new concept of stagflation. As workers and organized labor in the United States protested the ways the increasingly globalizing world was emerging, they saw China as holding the potential to exacerbate these dynamics. And their efforts culminated in a landmark petition launched in late 1977 for quotas on imported cotton work gloves. This was the first time that US manufacturers had attempted to limit Chinese goods since the Communist Party came to power. As US workers began to mobilize against Chinese imports, their efforts quickly became a diplomatic problem. The 1977 petition for quotas on Chinese exports failed, and this was largely due to US and Chinese political interference. But it not only revealed a political prioritization of geopolitics over domestic workers. Rather, the case also revealed a new dynamic emerging in the global economy that had profoundly important repercussions for China's reforms, US workers, and US-China trade more broadly. Around 60% of all cotton work gloves imported from China were purchased by companies, US companies, that also manufactured them. So in other words, the majority of US corporations calling for restrictions on Chinese gloves were the very same corporations purchasing the imports from China. As they struggled to keep their factories open during a period of widespread deindustrialization, especially in the textile industry, managers began to decrease their production of this kind of glove, cotton work gloves, and they replaced them with imports. In so doing, they hoped to save on costs and continue making other more complex types of gloves, at least temporarily. So as they were altering their own production processes, US manufacturers themselves began to see the China market as a source of inexpensive labor. What they wanted most of all from the quotas was market order. They needed time to make the adjustments to using Chinese labor. The decisions of US manufacturers reveals that a crucial component of China's convergence with the capitalist trading system was the change that was occurring in US corporations and the global division of labor that came with it. As Chinese leaders experimented with ways to lift their population out of poverty, this came at the expense of minimum wage textile workers in the United States and later other industries as well. But that impact on workers was fundamentally enabled by the decisions of executives at US corporations. American business people had already slowly begun internationalizing their manufacturing before trade with China reopened. In the 1970s, China's leaders began to adapt experimentally and haltingly to these emerging dynamics. So I want to conclude with just a couple of concluding thoughts, because ultimately my book is a book about change, from a China market of 400 million customers to 800 million workers. But underlying this story of change, however, is a deeply held continuity, and it's a political continuity, one that persistently framed trade and manufacturing in terms of the nation state, China's goods, and the United States' need to make more of its own. Despite the transformation in how US-China trade operated in practice, for the rest of the 20th century, American political rhetoric remained bound up with the nation state and Karl Crow's 1937 conception of 400 million customers. In 1983, President Reagan spoke of, quote, restoring America's reputation as a reliable supplier of goods to China, even as he discussed the moderate growth of Chinese exports that he had signed into law via a 5-year textile agreement. Nearly 2 decades later, well after China had opened its markets to foreign direct investment, and well after companies like Apple and Walmart had established manufacturing facilities there, President Clinton promised that World Trade Organization membership would, quote, open China's markets to American products made on American soil. It was politically expedient for trade to remain, in Clinton's depiction, about US sales. By this stage, the number of corporations that manufactured abroad had grown exponentially. American corporate structures had changed, but political rhetoric remained bound by early 20th century notions of trade. Yet at the heart of Made in China's symbolic power today lies a paradox. On the one hand, Made in China represents the epitome of globalized manufacturing. Goods marked with Made in China travel the globe, connecting people through a shared consumerism. On the other hand, it has come to represent the nation state. Marketing scholars describe this connection between country of origin labels and the nation state as nation branding. If Made in China represents a threat to American manufacturing, then its antithesis, Made in the USA, suggests that its effects could be countered too by the nation state. But as we know, particularly in the era of COVID and evergreen, goods labeled Made in China or Made in the USA are often only partially made in those countries. Instead, They are produced along chains of supply that usually include multiple countries along the way. Yet the political power of thinking of manufacturing within the confines of the nation state retains its strength. And this is the 21st century paradox of Made in China. It simultaneously represents the nation state and globalization. And one of the major consequences of this rhetorical stasis is a deflection away from the corporations that pursue cheap labor at any cost, and a singular focus on demonizing China for systemic economic problems within the United States. Throughout the 1970s, it was the interests of US capitalists and the Chinese state that slowly began to align. As they reworked the meaning of the China market from a site of customers to one of workers, they were enabled by US diplomatic assumptions. The trade was another form of people-to-people ties, that the American business people building ties were informal diplomats, and that labor concerns were an impediment to both trade and diplomacy. Now, if there's a lesson to this history of the making of Made in China, it is not one that calls for a return to an imagined ideal of manufacturing employment. Rather, it is a political vision that centers and listens to the concerns of working people, both domestically and internationally, and in the process frees itself from the facade that business people are informal diplomats working on behalf of the state. If geopolitics and globalization collided in the 1970s in ways that ultimately transformed US power, a slower, quieter change was also beginning to take shape, one in which the United States and China constructed an interdependent relationship in the very moment interdependence shaped US foreign policy. By making Made in China, US diplomats and business people such as Veronica Yap used trade to lay the groundwork of a process that might one day mark the end of their empire and the re-emergence of China's. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for this wonderful talk. I think we're all looking forward even more now to reading your book, of course. So we have some time for questions and answers, please. So if you have any questions for Professor Ingleson, please submit them through the Q&A button in Zoom, and then I can read them out, and we can take it from there. We already have our first question from my colleague, McCabe Kaliha. And he, first of all, thanks you for the talk and asks, can you tell us more about the production side? Who is making the goods in China? Where are the manufacturers, and at what level are the factories operating? For example, communes, local government firms, etc. How did Yap and others come to connect with the factories in the mid-1970s, i.e. pre-reform period?
Hi, McCabe. Thank you for your question, and it's a sort of strange environment not being able to see the audience. So the short answer is that the production in China was operating at multiple levels. Local government firms were the key sites, particularly for someone like Veronica Yap. She was operating in particular in Shanghai, was her main site of coordination with local textile firms. But the communes are particularly interesting because there were a number of US business people who, as they started to trade with China and import certain goods, such as, for example, tapestries, these US business people would go to the communes and see people sort of making tapestries or goods sort of within the sometimes on doorsteps and elsewhere. And this became actually quite an interesting romanticized understanding of production too, that China, and it became part of a sort of interpretation by some business people that Chinese people are so happy making these goods, they want to be sort of producing for us. They're so excited by it that they're doing so on the doorstep. With, there was this sort of story of a woman with her 2 children looking after her children in the commune while making tapestries. And so it's sort of tied into an idolized idea of happy textile workers and happy Chinese workers making goods for US consumers. I had in my slides, there was an image from a magazine, a US trade magazine, entitled Song of the Textile Worker, sort of harking back to late 19th century Britain, in fact, I think, in which there's sort of an idealization again of the Chinese workers. So on a technical level, it was occurring at most levels. For someone like Veronica Yap, it was occurring at much more at the local government firms. But the communes were particularly interesting in how they were sort of not only being integrated into US companies' stocks, but also understood by US corporations and business people in a particularly romanticized way.
All right, thank you. Maybe I can come in with a question at this point. One question I had, of course, I think it's very interesting, how you bring back the focus to the US side and what is changing there. But my question is what the Europeans are, what role they're playing in all of this, because I think you mentioned it in the talk that they had access, at least, well, depending on what country, but they kind of had an early start in a sense. So how are they competing with the Americans? And my thinking is also, how is the American side kind of seeing that and maybe pressuring their government to open up more quickly? Or so I wonder whether you could talk a bit more about what the role of the Europeans is in all of this.
Yeah, Europe and Japan in particular were so central to putting for China in particular, I think, to put pressure on US business people, and via the US business people, the US government, to speed things along. Throughout the decade, China would turn as much as possible to European or Japanese suppliers, particularly when diplomacy started to stall. So one of the things about trade with the United States in this era was that it was occurring sort of in the backdrop, against the backdrop of stalling diplomacy. So, Nixon and Mao have their famous meeting, but it takes until Deng and Carter for the two countries to reestablish full normalization. And in that sort of interim limbo period, trade is very much sort of taxed to whether or not diplomacy was going well or not. So when diplomacy started to stall in the mid 1970s, China began to cut back quite heavily on its purchases from the United States and turn to European and Japanese rivals. So it was actually a very useful bargaining chip for China to be able to sort of exert its own pressure and put its own needs and interests at the forefront of the trade relationship.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting.
Can I jump into the question?
Yeah.
Great. Well, I thought it was ingenious of you to think about the globalization side of it, and also the endurance of this whole nation-state narrative in this exchange. What I would like to hear more from you on is this whole idea of the goods themselves. You have some very interesting visuals. So Veronica Yap's products, or the products she sold, or she and her partners, they are very orientalized.
Yeah.
And I think actually the flip side was probably true too, as we think of products that Chinese consumers are buying from the other side. There's probably some Western products that they feel that they cannot quite make in China, so they would do the reverse. But as the world gets to be a little bit more global in more of the recent rounds, are we seeing some fading aspects of this whole nation-state's character in the products themselves? I mean, not just in the way we trade as people, but in the items that are getting exchanged.
So you mean in the 1970s?
No, now in the last couple of decades.
Let me answer in the 1970s first, and
Okay.
to go to your point. So in the 1970s, what's so interesting is that this sort of orientalization of the goods was, I think, as I mentioned, a very crucial component of just turning to everyday items. And so you see J.C. Penney's, another company that I trace in the book, and others who began to sort of use China as a source of cheap t-shirts, jeans, etc. In today's context, I mean, in practice, I think for decades, goods themselves cannot be understood or very rarely can be understood as bound up by sort of a singular geographic spot. In fact, it's often a selling point if you have a sort of locally made, item that becomes a sort of artisanal, desirable item precisely because it stands out from the sort of globalized economy. So the place of sort of business history in this, and business historians in particular have been emphasizing this for years, the place of the nation state in the production and manufacturing of goods has really diminished over the last 30 to 40 years. But it's the political rhetoric that just remains so profoundly bound by very early 20th century conceptions of what trade means. And partly I think it has to do with a politics that doesn't treat trade as interesting. We sort of, our eyes glaze over when we hear about trade, I think, politically, and the capacity, therefore, to engage with trade at a sort of more nuanced way is something that goes beyond simply a nation state and beyond, operates beyond, where it's, to connect what we know, which is we know that, an iPhone can be designed in California and made in China. Consumers know that. And at the same time, there's still this political power in saying made in the USA. Biden has been capitalizing on this. And the capacity to bridge those two things, to rethink trade and to reconceptualize trade in the larger political discourse is just profoundly difficult, I think, and it's profoundly static. Despite what we know, despite COVID and Evergreen and all the things that we are familiar with, I think today. Yeah. Speaking of COVID.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the local artisanal aspect is certainly still alive and well, and is quite is somewhat of a contrast to what we knew of the earlier period. But I think there's also a certain quality assurance component to it too, and we see it more in Hong Kong, that we are trying to resuscitate that brand that made in Hong Kong means quality. And in that sense, it's been alive and well because people north of the border are coming over to buy baby formula as well. So I'm still trying to work that out, and I think your analysis here is very inspiring.
No, I think actually, John, you're making a really important point that I want to sort of add there, because you see it also. I see it in the United Kingdom all the time too, like particularly in the post-Brexit era, everything is made in Britain, and it's just this absolute celebration of local British food. And I think there is a distinction between manufactured items and the relationship between them and country of origin labels, and food production and its relationship to country of origin. And so I do think that distinction, again, helps perhaps explain why we have this sort of static on the one hand and familiarity with changing manufacturing on the other hand. But yeah, the relationship between food and sort of those kinds of items and quality via nation states there very much is alive and well today. Yeah, you see it. Yeah.
Thanks.
I mean, one more question I wanted to ask, and probably because I work on the early 20th century, so I have to kind of try to bring the story back a bit to that. Obviously, you're making the point that one big change is seeing China from a sort of a source of export markets to becoming a source of labor. But do you think they are, and I'm not saying that there's not this break and this is a new development, but of course, it's not that there were foreign firms in the early 20th century that specifically manufactured in China kind of because of cheap labor. I'm sort of thinking General Electric, British American Tobacco. It's not that these business people, they kind of understood that was one of the advantages of China. So do you see any kind of I suppose, continuities there, maybe even in terms of experience that some people that, I mean, that's still possible, at least that within a particular company, there were, you know, there kind of institutional memory that still, so that there's some kind of continuities that might have been there. Yeah, I'm just wondering, because that's, I mean, that's kind of what I've come across in my work, but yeah.
That's a really, really, really important point. So in terms of the institutional memory, there were a number of business people who had either sort of been involved with China trade pre Second World War, or their companies had, and sort of that was certainly a very important and crucial component of the sort of establishment of trade relations for those business people in the 1970s. But your bigger point about thinking about the continuities between what it means to be a multinational corporation, right? A multinational corporation in the early 20th century was still, as your examples of British American Tobacco Company and others point to, was still sometimes using cheap labor or seeing China as a sort of, or other places as a site of manufacturing. I think the biggest distinction, the biggest distinction, if we think about the sort of large-scale change in multinational corporations over the course of the 20th century, is that often in the early 20th century, multinational corporations were, for the most part, based upon resource extraction, oil, cotton, tobacco, etc. So resource extraction was one of the key forms of multinational corporations, or it was in order to manufacture in a country and avoid tariffs and sell to the country in which they were manufacturing. The idea of manufacturing overseas for cheap labor and then shipping those goods back home to the United States, for example, or to Europe or elsewhere, that transformation was very, very much coincided with the transformations in shipping, transformation in aircraft, as John has written about, and that these transformations in technology and in communication were also profoundly important to the transformations in what it meant to be a multinational corporation and what it meant to manufacture in the world. And I think at the scale at which we have seen in the post-Cold War era, or in the post-World War II era during the Cold War, has been really, really fundamental to changing how global labor has been positioned via manufacturing.
Yeah, thank you. We had one more question that was sort of very general, basically asking I guess what your work, how that would inform, or how from, like, based on your work, how you would see the current, I guess, developments in trade between China and the US, and the current developments. I don't know whether, I mean, it's a very open question, but I don't know whether there's anything you want to comment on particularly.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm happy to comment as an observer. I think, and I suppose, I mean, I always hesitate with, scholars trying to make predictions, so I'm not going to do that. But I do think one of the things that we're seeing, and one of the things that's very important, is the ways that corporations and corporate interests need to be understood as distinct from the state. That corporations and business people are going to operate in the interests of their shareholders and of themselves. And the connections between the nation state and a corporation may have, in the early 20th century, been more connected. Scholars in the United States call this dollar diplomacy, the idea that business people going abroad to Latin America or to wherever, or to China, were operating sort of as informal diplomats on behalf of the state. I think that connection, and with assistance of the state, that the state assisted their processes, and in helping business people, the state was helping itself. I think that those connections between the state and corporate power need to be profoundly reconfigured and profoundly questioned, because the extent to which a corporation now, which operates at a multinational plane, as we've just discussed, right, beyond the nation state itself, means that governments making policies relating to trade need to be thinking multilaterally and not in terms of nation states themselves. So precisely because the nature of corporations and finance have changed, so too do the ways in which policies get made. A small point, if I may, that really stands out to me in the sort of contemporary environment is as Biden was putting through his environmental policy, his huge environmental changes that he put forward, one component of that had been to implement I think it was a 15% tax on multinational corporations across the board. And that ended up getting scrapped. But that would have been a profoundly important recalibration in how the US state understood at a multilateral level the place of multinational corporations. And it didn't happen, it got kicked out. But that's the kind of sort of thinking that I would say needs to happen, rather than China blaming, for example. It's not how things operate now.
Yeah, thank you. Do we have any final questions for Dr. Ingleson? If not, then I think what remains for us to do, Elizabeth, is to thank you again for taking the time to give us such a wonderful talk. Once again, everyone, please keep a lookout for Dr. Ingleson's new book, which is going to come out next year. I'm sure we all want to read even more now that we've heard a wonderful presentation. Yeah, and thank you to everyone for tuning in, and please keep a lookout for future events, both in the Delta on the Move lecture series and in the Chinese Business History webinar series that we'll advertise as usual on our social media. So thank you to everyone in the audience, and once again, Dr. Ingleson, thank you very much for giving us this wonderful talk.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.